This is the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Mark Turman, the Executive Director of Denison Forum. Thanks for joining us again for another conversation, sitting down with Dr. Jim Denison, the CEO of Denison Ministries and cultural apologist for Denison Forum. Jim, how are you doing today?
I am doing well, Dr. Turman. How are you?
Doing great. I do want to set up our conversation today off of a little bit of the Easter story. I was reading some of that in the text in Scripture and came to the trial of Jesus. And as we go through that part of the story, and Jesus is on trial with Pilate and then with Herod and then back with Pilate again. And there's one phrase in the Easter story where it says that Pilate did everything he could to release him. Did everything he could to try to get out of this situation, which is an interesting story in and of itself. But the people respond, "We have no king but Caesar," which is probably one of the most tragic statements in all of Scripture, right? Especially from this Jewish audience. Why is that such a terrible statement on their part?
Yeah, it's on two levels, I think. The first has to do with what's actually going on in the politics of this moment. As you know, Pilate was on thin ice, really, from the time he became governor of Judea. He made some early decisions that turned out to be horrible. There was always this challenge for the Romans relative to the Jews. To back up real quickly, as they would conquer a people, typically they would require them to be subject to taxation, and then they would kind of leave them alone in terms of their culture, that sort of thing. This worshiping the emperor every year was more of a loyalty oath than anything else. Well, the Jews just wouldn't do that. They wouldn't obviously worship the emperor. They wouldn't even use the coinage that was used because it had the emperor's face on it, and that was idolatry for them. Well, early on, Pilate tried to force some of that stuff on them. He paraded into Jerusalem using Roman insignia that caused a riot or a rebellion. At one point, he took money from the Jewish treasury to rebuild the water system, and there was another riot, another rebellion. And so he was on thin ice. There were always these challenges. And so what's going on here in this specific moment is that the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, the religious authorities, are wanting to force his hand. It's obvious to them that he doesn't want to execute Jesus, that Jesus has done nothing worthy of this at all.
Right.
And even Pilate can see that. Everybody can see that. So what they're saying to Pilate essentially is, if you do this, we're going to report you to Caesar. If you let him go, if you won't do what we want you to do, we have no king but Caesar, they're saying. And here's this Jesus who we're saying claims to be king of the Jews. Now, in our mind, that's a threat to Rome. And you're not seeing this as such. We're accusing that this Galilean carpenter is about a movement that could threaten the Romans, and that's what Rome can't allow. We have no king but Caesar. If you don't recognize what we're up to here, then you're in some level part of a conspiracy against Caesar, and we're going to report you, and you're on thin ice already, and who knows what could happen. And so that's really the politics of what's going on.
So in that sense, the Jewish religious leaders didn't see Jesus as a political leader in the same way that Caesar was.
That's right.
But they're using these basically political tactics to put pressure on him as a vulnerable and weak leader, politician, essentially. We typically think of Pilate more in a military sense, but he's probably more of a political figure before he is a military figure.
Serves at the discretion of Rome, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so he's we would call him a weak politician in that sense. And they're simply using the political game that we see played out in modern times all the time in different situations. They're using that political game to pressure him.
That's right. They know that their theological charges are going to hold no water here.
Right.
You know, they convicted him before the Sanhedrin of heresy.
So the religious charges are their big charges.
That's right.
But they can't get any action on that.
Any more than you could accuse me of heresy and get a criminal court to prosecute me.
Right.
You could come along and accuse me of not believing in the Trinity as I should or something like that. And no civil court's going to listen to that. Obviously, an ecclesiastical court would, but not a civil court. Well, that's their problem here. They've condemned Jesus, again, improperly, obviously, illegally, for heresy, for blasphemy. Well, now, Pilate's not going to care about that, so now they have to shift gears entirely and make an accusation that Jesus is trying to lead a rebellion against Rome, against Caesar, against the emperor himself, knowing that that would be something Pilate has to pay attention to. The number one job Pilate has is to keep that from happening.
Right.
That's what Rome judges success for Pilate by, is the degree to which he keeps these rebellious Jews in line. trying. Now, ultimately, at the end of the day, and this is past the New Testament, we have early records, Josephus and others, that said that ultimately Pilate was recalled back to Rome for being an improper and a weak administrator and leader, and probably would have been executed, except the Caesar died. They had a change in emperors, and he was allowed to go free. And beyond that moment, we don't really know how historians
Got off on a technicality.
That's exactly right. Now, there are a lot of legends beyond that he himself became a Christian leader, who knows. Then others on the other side that would say he committed suicide and could never get over having convicted Jesus, but that's all legend. What we do know is that he's on thin ice, he's in hot water here politically, and that's the reason they're making this charge, where they're this claim, we have no king but Caesar.
Right. So, in an ironic sense, they're actually making a statement that in any other context probably they would despise.
That's right.
To be saying this. They would literally, you kind of have to wonder if some of these people went home a day or two later and just their stomachs were turning that they made this statement when they've been so opposed to everything that Rome and that Caesar is about. But it sparked my thinking in this direction. I've heard you quote many times, I believe, the Nietzschean quote of our will to power. And we get into a conversation today that could possibly touch on a few nerves. Just in the last few years, really, the word nationalism has become a significant part of the cultural conversation that's going on not only in our country, but now with the events of Russia and Ukraine. Now we're seeing a version of that playing out in that situation and conversation as well. Give us just a general basic definition of nationalism and how it compares to what I would say is the better, truer form, which is patriotism. And what we'll get in a moment to what the Bible says about either of those. What we need to be careful about, what we need to be on guard against, but also what we need to be in favor of in terms of being citizens of this world and being citizens of nations, as all of us are. But what's the definition of nationalism, and why do we need to be concerned?
Yeah, it's a great question. And your question, as you know, points really to the problem, is there is no one definition of nationalism. There are a lot of people that mean by nationalism patriotism. They would say, I'm a nationalist in the sense that I'm patriotic, that I believe in America. Some America first ideology that's come around in recent years, make America great again would be the Trump model, all those sorts of things would be in some minds just doing patriotism. It's just another way of saying I'm an American, I believe in America. I think America should put Americans first. I think in the global issues we ought to be asking about NATO, about our connections outside of America. To what benefit does America come with that? And we should always put our nation ahead of other nations.
Yeah, in pretty much the good sense of the term, I love my country. I stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I love the flag. I'm happy to be in this part of the world. I love where I live.
Exactly.
In the best sense of the term.
Exactly, and that would be the idea. Justin the Martyr wrote about how his Christians made good citizens, how they paid their taxes, how they supported the empire. You read Romans 13. And we'll get to this in a moment, but lots of places where Scripture calls us to pray for the emperor and to be supportive of the officials that are in charge and to be good citizens as best we can be. So for a lot of American history, nationalism, if you even use the phrase, was really just synonymous with patriotism.
Right.
Just meant I believe in America, I love America, I'm willing to serve America with my taxes, with my military service, even sacrificially. My father fought in World War II, my grandfather in World War I. Both of them were patriots. They both enlisted in the Army because both of them wanted to do their part to serve America. So in that sense, nationalism is a positive thing, if it's just really synonymous with patriotism. In recent years, however, there's grown up a different psychology around nationalism as well, which has in it this idea that America is intrinsically better than any other nation. That we somehow have a God-given divine mandate that would make us as a city on a hill, a nation that God uniquely loves or uniquely blesses or uniquely wants to work in and with and through, and creates a bias toward America in the context of other countries, other ethnicities even, that can feel a little prejudicial relative to the rest of the world and can be a misreading of Scripture.
Right.
And we can come talk about that. So that's a second piece of this. Then a third piece of nationalism per se becomes extremely political, extremely divisive. We decide that to support the nation means a certain set of political positions. And if you disagree with these, then you're no longer a good American. And so I'm going to be a nationalist in the sense of having a very specific worldview, a very specific set of almost creedal convictions and beliefs. And I'm typically tend to be, quite frankly, Republican, and even just some small parties within Republicanism, let's say, but at least a version of Republicanism. And if you disagree with this, that you no longer believe in America, you no longer love America, you're no longer patriotic. Well, one of the things patriotism had always said was, and Mark Twain made this point and others, that I love my country, right or wrong, but I love it enough to tell it when I think it's wrong. I have to be willing to disagree with my country. The civil rights movement of the 60s would be an example of patriotic Americans, like Martin Luther King Jr. and others coming forward and saying, I love my country so much, I want America to fulfill its founding promise. I want it to be a nation that believes all men are created equal. I want America to be better. So there's a critical piece in the patriotism that you don't see in some version of nationalism.
So, again, maybe this is a place where the roads between nationalist and patriotism separate. A nationalist might be inclined to say, in the worst sense of the word, never be critical, never be oppositional. And a patriotism mindset would be, I will love my country, but I won't be afraid to point out its weaknesses.
Because I love it.
Because I love it, and because I want it to be better. I don't believe that it is intrinsically or automatically, by definition, always right or always better than other nations, that we have to have this flexibility and room to disagree and even to complain. And if you don't have the flexibility and freedom to complain, then you're likely headed toward a dangerous direction.
You are. You're certainly moving away from what the founders intended. That's why the Bill of Rights exists, to protect the rights of the minority. We don't have a true democracy. In a true democracy, 50+1 wins every single time.
Right.
What we have is a republic. It's a democratic republic. We elect our leaders in a democratic sense, but we also have built-in, baked-in protections for minorities, whatever those might be. And the challenge always is how to balance those, the majority minorities within the context. But some versions of nationalism would say that if you disagree with my version, you're no longer patriotic. You're not a true American.
And in the worst sense, you need to be removed in one way or another. You're removed out of the country or removed completely, right?
Yeah. And there can be that extremism. There really can. There can be a militaristic sort of dimension of all of this as well. And by the way, let me hasten to say this is true right and left. This isn't just a January 6th sort of a thing. This isn't just those that would support Trump, some of them, not all by any means, but some who would think that if you disagree with Trump, you're disagreeing with God. You're disagreeing with God's elected official or whatnot. We hear the same thing when Democrats are in power. We hear the same thing on occasion from folk who, in fact, there's some in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party right now that could be as nationalistic as some that would be in kind of the right-wing side of the Republican Party and would say if you disagree with them, that you're no longer caring for all Americans, that you're homophobic or you're bigoted or prejudiced or narrow-minded, discriminatory, dangerous to America and to its future, because they think their vision is the only proper vision for the nation. And if you disagree with that, then you're no longer patriotic. You can see it on both sides of the spectrum.
Right. And bring this into the conversation as you see it as well, how we see that playing out within the conflict between Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, what you have there in the Russian side is two very different versions of what patriotic nationalism could look like. The one that would say Ukraine belongs to Russia. It was a Russian idea. It has always been Russian in ethnicity. The idea of a modern Ukraine is a fiction, they would say. And really to build the Russian empire, we really need to include in our empire those parts of the empire that have historically been part of us and always have been and should be. That would be Putin's version of patriotism that we would call nationalistic. He's not willing to hear criticism to the contrary. He's not willing to consider contrary fact. He would be more nationalistic than patriotic in that space. Another narrative that would be inside the Russian model would be very different from that. And it would say that we have ethnic ties and history and have heritage here together. And so we ought to have Ukraine be participating in the Russian empire, but we're not going to force them to do it.
Right.
We're going to support democratic elections. We're going to support freedom there. And we're going to be patriotic enough as Russians to want others to be Russian, but we're not going to force them to be so. Well, where we are right now is the possibility anyway, as you and I are having this conversation, where the invasion is going so poorly, that now there's an increasing concern that Putin may want to destroy Ukraine to save it, so to speak. If he can't have it, nobody can have it. That would be a nationalistic, hyper-nationalistic sense that the Russian Empire is all that matters. And if he has to destroy something to keep it from falling in enemy hands so as to protect the Russian Empire, then he's willing to do it. That's a very frightening possible future scenario.
Right, and could easily be the direction that he ends up going.
Well, it could be. You think about even tactical nuclear weapons are becoming more and more discussed. He has 2,000 of them. We have 100 of them on the NATO side in Europe. Right. That wouldn't be a Hiroshima and Nagasaki sort of a thing. It would be more limited. They could take out installations, could take out cities, things like that. There's been more discussion about neutron bombs, of which he has many as well, that would destroy people but not buildings. And so there are military ways, if he can't win on the ground, if he can't win with a ground invasion, which is happening now, he has other options, other military options. And as long as he limits them to Ukraine, which is not itself a NATO country, a NATO-aligned country, there's some question as to whether that would cross a red line, whether that would trigger NATO engagement and involvement. What if he did use tactical nuclear weapons? Would we then, on humanitarian grounds, feel we had to come back and respond, or would we say that's not NATO, and at the end of the day, we're not going to cross that line? We just don't know.
Lots of big questions.
Biological weapons, chemical weapons, all sorts of ways that this could get far worse than it is even now.
Yeah, saw an article recently where our government had made statements of concern and warning about the use of chemical weapons and that type of thing.
UK has done the same thing.
And where this actually gets down to affecting individuals, seen a couple of stories even recently of where someone in Ukraine who has relatives in Russia, they're calling their parents, their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles, or even siblings who are back in Russia saying, this is what's happening, and then hearing from their Russian relatives, no, it's not, that's all fake. Let's talk a little bit about the role of journalism in this whole conversation, media, and how it plays into our understanding and can either kind of guide us or push us to being either good patriots or being, in some ways, unhealthy nationalists.
And those are your choices, aren't they, ultimately? And part of the genius of the founders was they understood that democracy is always going to be imperiled. As Plato said, that citizens would inevitably discover they could cast ballots based on personal preference rather than the collective good, and democracy would be imperiled. So they knew that elections would be one thing that would keep them from despotism and this worst form of nationalism where my version of America is the only right version, and if you disagree, you're not patriotic, and I need to cancel you on some level. They knew that would be part. They knew the other would be a free press that would hold people accountable to the truth, people that would tell the truth, people that couldn't be subject to the control of the government per se. They felt that was going to be absolutely critical to this democratic experiment, and they were right. Well, now we're seeing the free press threatened on two levels. The one is the kind of censorship we're seeing in Russia right now, where external social media platforms are being expelled from the country, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, whatever, where they're increasingly branding anything that does get through as fake news, as you're describing, and are declaring a narrative that cannot be disagreed with in terms of how they're controlling the state media. Putin's been about controlling the state media for years. Turkey's doing the same thing. Iran does the same thing. And even in this day of digital technology and social media, it's easier to control than you might think, just because you can get control of the platforms that make those things available through the internet in a specific geography. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is when the free press is of its own volition less free, when it becomes so ideologically driven, when the free press itself, and that would be the case in America, is primarily led by people that express only the left side of the cultural conversation and see the right side as unpatriotic, see the right side as homophobic or bigoted, prejudiced, narrow-minded, discriminatory. And so of their own accord, they're not being censored, they're self-censoring. And they're coming forward with a version of reality that is itself interpreted more than reported.
And would you say that that's something we seem to be seeing more of now than any other time in our history? Is this idea of self-censorship because of being so biased in one direction?
Absolutely.
And that's and how is big technology a part of that?
It's a very big part of it, really, on several levels. I'm 63 years old. I'm getting older by the day. Old enough to remember a day when media consisted of newspapers, books, and television and radio, all of which went through editorial filters before it ever got published. No one had the ability just to publish something on a YouTube. Didn't exist. And so as a result, you had the ability, because there was control of how media worked, that everybody wanted media to be objective. And they were buying ads on television shows based on the degree to which they were objective. That's what Walter Cronkite was all about, the most trusted man in America. And you made money by being objective and reporting news through this filter in this way. Nowadays, everybody with a cell phone has their own media platform. Now there's 24/7 news and all of that. So the news outlets can't make money just by being objective news reporters anymore. So now they know the specific audiences their advertisers are trying to reach. They know what algorithms, and it's frightening what they can know about their audiences by virtue of these analytics and algorithms. So they therefore know what agendas they need to be about to reach the audience their advertisers are trying to reach, and they themselves typically embrace those same agendas. So you get Fox on one side and MSNBC on the other. And if you just watch those two, you'll even see how the ads are different, how the constituent audiences are obviously very, very different between those things. That's how they make money now. You can't make money by reporting objective news. And what they're all up against is my ability to be my own reporter using my cell phone, to be tweeting as I wish, to be posting to Facebook, YouTube videos, that sort of thing. So now all news is commentary.
Which is also now breeding this idea that you can't trust any of it. If you're wanting to know about the world, you're concerned about where either your local community, your country, or the world, something as far away as Ukraine and the crisis going on there, you're trying to understand these things. There seems to be a growing cynicism that, well, I don't know that I can trust any of these people.
And they're probably right about that. That's why you want several versions.
Okay, so the best recommendation is talk a little bit about, I've heard you, again, mention this before, the idea of aggregating your news sources. And I think in some ways, I think what we're seeing in our country and what we are going to necessarily see in the world is a reconstituting of what real journalism is, to move back toward this more objective idea, because we've been on this subjective direction for a pretty good while now. But that's a big animal to try to deal with, because if I am trying to make money and stay in business, and I do that by pushing a narrative that I like or that I agree with, it's hard to get out of that motive. But how does the common believer learn to aggregate news so that they feel like they're getting a reasonable picture of what's going on of any issue or region that they're concerned about?
Yeah, that's actually the practical question, no doubt, because again, what's behind all this is this postmodern relativistic idea that there is no truth, that's just your truth and my truth. And so the idea that you could report the news objectively is rejected by a lot of the culture just to begin with. I would come along and say Walter Cronkite was more objective. They might say, well, he really wasn't. Even in deciding what to report and what not to report, that's a subjective decision. And at the end of the day, it was his truth as opposed to your truth. So I ought to be reporting my agenda because that's my truth, they would say.
But the idea being is you can't know it. You just can't know it anyway.
That's right. You can't know it anyway. All you can know is my experience or your experience would be what they would say.
No.
So in this world, since we can't create our own media sources that could make money being as objective as possible here, what we have to do is a little like Bible translations. Biblical translations all have their own theory of translation. One could be extremely literal. That might be the New American Standard. One might be a paraphrase. That would be the New Living Translation. And some would be a dynamic equivalent kind of in the middle. That could be the NIV. The ESV is a little more literal, that sort of thing. So you pick a Bible translation based on what you're wanting the theory to give you. And the right way to do it, I think, as you have time and means, is to consult more than one from different theories. Same thing here. When I'm writing an article, a daily article, if I'm looking for news reports, I do my best to check across the spectrum. Even if it's a pretty simple, objective thing that's being reported here. I'll look to see what Fox says. I'll look to see what CNN says. I'll look at MSNBC if they have something out there. I'll look at the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, which will look a lot different than the editorial page of the Washington Post or the New York Times might be. And as I look at these various versions of this, you get pieces of the story here. It's the old parable of blind people that come across an elephant, and one's touching the leg and thinks it's a tree. Right. The other's touching the trunk and thinks it's a hose. Well, it's both. And what you want to do is get all of their stories together to get in kind of an assembly of what it is we're talking about. The more urgent the issue, the more important it is that we do this. Now, the good news is you don't have to subscribe to 20 newspapers to do this. You can, through digital technology and journalism that's available, pretty easily, pretty quickly, I think, if you know kind of what these strata are. So again, on a spectrum, I'm thinking from right to left of Fox, and then maybe over to Wall Street Journal, then maybe to Reuters, someplace more in the middle, and BBC. Then to the left, you look at Washington Post and New York Times and MSNBC as kind of a spectrum of the way these things typically tend to function, and trying to read across that spectrum where I can, so as to get kind of an aggregated sense of the reality of what's behind all of that.
And so we would encourage people to do that and to be cautious about getting connected to one or two exclusively and never going outside of that lane.
In fact, I would say quickly, if I could, I should have said this a moment ago, we need to be intentional about reading what we don't agree with. Intentional about that. If you're only going to do two sources, if you're going to be following what's happening in Ukraine, for instance, and Fox is your favorite news source, let's just say, let's pick that, make sure you're also reading CNN. If CNN is your favorite news source, make sure you're also reading Fox. If you read the New York Times, make sure you also read the Wall Street Journal. Make sure you're getting a side that isn't the one with which you agree. Otherwise, it's echo chambers. Right. You're only listening to what you agree with. You're only reinforcing your own biases, whatever those biases might be. So make sure intentionally to read something with which you're typically ideologically going to disagree, and iron sharpens iron.
Which is, again, another one of these. It's amazing to me how many new terms we keep creating. I'm not sure we ever used the term echo chamber very much until about 30 months ago.
Yeah, oh, exactly.
And I would suspect that one of the real dangers of echo chambers is you don't even realize you're in an echo chamber.
That's right.
And if something's not causing you to think, if something's not kind of getting under your skin a little bit because you disagree with it, then you might find yourself in an echo chamber.
In fact, you're probably in one without even intending to be in one. One of the things Google Analytics are so good at is knowing where you go, what you read, and making sure the rest of the stuff that shows up on your search pages aligns with what you're already looking at. They make money by getting you to click on stuff. And so they don't want you to be seeing things they know you're not going to click on, things that would be on the other side of the partisan divide. And so people don't know this, but if you and I, Mark, were sitting right now side by side with, let's just pick on Google, with a Google homepage in front of us, yours looks different than mine. There's not one Google homepage like a printed front page of the Dallas Morning News.
Yeah. Which is probably what the common person thinks.
Think would be the case. No, yeah. Your Google homepage looks like it does based on what Google knows that you like to read, what you like to look at. And so it's going to aggregate what it shows you differently than it is going to show me mine, and certainly somebody else. And so if you're only reading what pops up, if you type a search term into a search engine, what you're going to get is based not only on popularity, but also based on your previous search history.
And starts from the first time you use it.
That's right. They have years of data on you now.
Yeah, even from the standpoint of they essentially know what part of the country you're in.
That's right.
And they make some suppositions based on the fact that that's where you are.
And advertisers do the same thing.
No.
They know where I live. They know where I'm at any moment in time. It's really pretty frightening what they know about me. And the advertisers know this and are able to use this in a way that automatically, through analytics, causes ads to show up that I'm more likely to click on. And if I ever click on an ad, I can see ads like it on my home pages or even on the articles that I'll read for months to come will be around that same sort of a thing. The other day, I looked at a book that was on Amazon. I was thinking about buying for Kindle, chose not to buy it. I've gotten 3 prompts since over the last 2 or 3 weeks asking, are you still considering that book? Right. Would you still like to buy that? Because it knows I looked at it and chose not to buy it. It's frightening how much they know about us.
Yeah, and how much things are tailored.
That's right.
To continue to drive us as consumers.
That consumers is the bottom line here.
Yeah, because it's not like that they're necessarily interested in us becoming a political proponent of any position necessarily. They may or may not be, but if it's a consumer-driven reality, then the whole deal is can we continue to make income off of it?
That's how this works. That's how digital marketing works. We do something kind of like that in our ministry. We're able to place ads for our content in Google space based on analytics, based on who's most likely to view them. And we do that based on what kind of music they listen to or what kind of sites they go to. We're just more likely to get them to click on our content based on their search history. And Google makes that possible for us, and therefore that's how they make money. Facebook, same way. I remember when Facebook was struggling to make money, if you can imagine, had no idea how to make money. And they figured out they could get people to place ads based on Facebook search histories, what they know about you, what Facebook knows about you from your profile. And that's gold for advertisers.
And they could monetize that way.
They can monetize based on advertising that's tailored to the specifics of the person that's consuming content on that Facebook feed. If I'm buying a billboard for our ministry out on Dallas North Tollway, well, that's a crapshoot as to who's going to see it, who's not going to see it. I can know a little maybe about the demographics of that part of the tollway as opposed to someplace else, but not much. That's how advertising used to be. You put a big ad in the sports section of the newspaper as opposed to the media section or as opposed to the opinions. And that's about as specific as you could be. Now, they can tailor ads that are so specific to us because that's how they make money. And at the end of the day, the media business is a business. So the way to fight against that is, as we're saying, because we're all in this space, if you're going to consume digital content, this is going to be your experience, is to be very specific about reading things that wouldn't pop up,
right,
things that Google wouldn't present to you because they're not in your typical analytical history. And in that way, make sure you're seeing other sides of stories, whatever those stories might be.
Yeah, and I would add to that, it seems to me that we are seeing, again, this journey of understanding and realizing how significant the press is in understanding our world, and maybe coming back around to the idea that real journalism does require real professionalism. It does require real training, and you may or may not agree with the particular bent or direction of a certain source, but that doesn't mean that source isn't credible in some significant ways.
That's right.
And that's different from saying anything and everything that you might see on a social media feed is not going to have the same credibility. Just because we all can be quote unquote reporters with our own technology, that doesn't mean that the skill set of real journalism doesn't matter. It matters a great deal. We obviously all can't go to Ukraine and watch what's happening or be in a cabinet meeting where Vladimir Putin is making decisions. We can't be in those environments, but there are people that have training and expertise that we don't have.
And pay a great price to do this on
and
occasion.
Pay a great price.
That risk their lives. A couple of Fox reporters that were killed recently in
Ukraine.
Yeah,
exactly. And we, and others as well, and probably others will pay that price.
I'm afraid so.
But again, reasonably aggregating from several different sources, including the ones that you don't totally or naturally agree with in a more simple way, helps you to have a more realistic and to realize that all sources are not the same. Some sources are to be more trusted than others.
That is so true. And you really want to trust those sources that have the more editorial layers to them, as opposed to the aggregating sources. HuffPost, for instance, I've published a lot on HuffPost over the years, is an aggregating site with almost no editorial oversight. You can pretty much, once you get through the door, can post anything there, and they'll do virtually nothing with your article except put it there. And it looks like somebody's endorsing it because it's on HuffPost. Well, pretty much anybody could put it there. Wikipedia articles are notorious for the degree to which the editorial standards are so weak depending on what the article is and who wrote it and who happened to submit it and how that all happened to be. I read the New York Times every day. I do so, first of all, because it's the most influential newspaper in America. Second, because I so admire their journalistic standards. I really think they are the best in the business. I think Wall Street Journal gets close, I think Washington Post gets close, but I really think they probably, if I'm looking for the best newspaper from a journalistic standards of excellence perspective, it's the New York Times. Now, I disagree with 3/4 of what I see in the New York Times relative to editorial content, relative to even slants on stories. I'm sure the editorial board of the New York Times and I would cancel each other's votes on a whole lot of issues that are going on in the culture today. There are exceptions to that. I'm grateful for David Brooks that writes there, grateful for Ross Douthat. Brett Stevens would certainly be a more conservative voice there, depending on who you're reading. Tom Friedman, I think, is brilliant in the space. I think Paul Krugman is brilliant, even though I disagree with most of what he writes from an ideological perspective. But I admire the standards, that they're there, and the journalistic excellence. So my encouragement would be to look for excellence in what you're reading, but again, across diversity of lines. If I can only pick two, I'd pick Wall Street Journal as a more conservative, New York Times as a more progressive. And with both of those, you're looking at excellent platforms, excellent media.
And so what you're talking about in terms of editorial standard, journalistic standards, kind of like what we see in the medical community when doctor scientists are working on a disease or the vaccines that we've come through with this idea of peer review.
Exactly, okay? Same idea.
There has to be a peer, you're looking for a source that has significant levels of peer review. So it's not simply, hey, I saw this and this is the way it is. That any individual in the world can do that technologically now. But when you start adding in layers of peer review and fact checking and that type of thing, you're raising the credibility of what the information is that's coming.
And that's so critical. There was a day when you didn't have to do that because it couldn't get published unless it was peer reviewed.
Yeah, you had to go through all kinds of layers to get
My
to
first
that.
book that I published was the first time I had seen this in person. I assumed it was my book. I'm writing it. So at the end of the day, I get to say what's in it. Actually not. At the end of the day, it's their book. They're deciding to publish. Brobman and Holman published my first book. My editor was a person I'd known in doctoral work. At the end of the day, she had the final say because she worked for them and they were the ones publishing my book. And my only recourse at the end of the day was to pull the contract. If she and I just couldn't agree on something, at the end of the day, all I could do is leave the contract and go take my book someplace else.
And you got to speak into that. You got to have conversations with her, but she also had people behind her.
That's right.
That were ensuring the integrity of what this book was going to
That's
be about.
That's right, because it's a B&H imprint, and so the facticity of it was absolutely critical to that. Thinking of an example that happened a few years ago where a pretty well-known person who's kind of an amateur historian wrote a biography of Thomas Jefferson, claiming him to be an evangelical Christian and putting him in a very different light. Well, that book got past the editorial processes of that publisher. They really were just lax on the job. The book got published. It actually got on bookshelves. It started getting reviewed. Historians started talking about all the fallacies that were in this book, and the bookseller pulled the book, literally took it off of the bookshelves and ate the cost of it and stopped the publication of it because at the end of the day, it was their book, even more than it was the author's book. Now, if you self-publish, that's different, and that's, again, part of the challenge here, that you can create a book on your own accord if you wish to, just like you can publish to YouTube if you want to, using your cell phone, and that's easier to do than ever. So just the fact it's a physical book doesn't mean it's been through this process. Pay attention to who published it. Pay attention to editorial processes by which this was created. Nothing I write ever gets public without going through editorial, for instance. But our editors are our own staff at the end of the day. So someone could come along and say, well, you're not getting critics to edit your stuff. And you're right. We don't have the time to go through that process with what we do. But we at the very least get professional editors to review, to fact check. They check every link of everything that I publish to make sure that link is accurate, to make sure that what I'm saying is correct. They check every quote to make sure that I'm accurately quoting what's there. And even on occasion, they'll say, I'm not sure this reads right, or this feels right, or this rings tilt with me a little bit. And I'll always make adjustments based on what they say to me. So we inside Denison Ministries do our very best. We have full-time professional editors here who help us to create that level of what we hope anyway is excellence and professional integrity. Well, there's a challenge just because it's so much easier to get content out now. And so not everything that appears on the internet is by any means something that's come through this process. Be discerning.
Right.
Be wise as serpents as well as innocent as doves.
Absolutely. Well, we just have a few minutes before we finish up a little bit. Bring this back around to Scripture for me. What the places where the Bible encourages us to be good citizens, to be good patriots. I think when Jesus says, render to Caesar what's Caesar's and to God what is God's, that's a positive statement.
It is.
He's not being belligerent toward Rome at this point. And the Bible has a lot to say about what it means to be a good patriot, to love your country, and to be a good citizen. How would you kind of wrap that up from a scriptural standpoint?
Yeah, thank you. My bottom line is always obey your highest authority. And so to the degree that I can be a good citizen of my heavenly kingdom and my earthly kingdom, I need to do that. That's paying taxes to whom taxes is owed, as Romans 13 says.
And we're called to do that.
We are called by Scripture.
Tax season is upon us, and
That's right.
we cringe over it a lot, but it's, I started feeling a lot better about my taxes when I realized that the fire engine that just went by my house, the police officer who was keeping things safe, and my family members, have 2 nephews in the active military right now. When I realized I was paying their salary, I felt a lot better about it.
I feel the same way. I picked up 2 of our perfect grandchildren. We have 4, and all of them are perfect. And picked 2 of them the other day and brought them over to the house for a few days of cousins camp, as we called it. So we're driving our way north up on LBJ here in Dallas, and we're coming at the I-635, I-30 interchange that's being completely rebuilt right now in Dallas. And I'm looking around at this massive structure, this massive project that's being done here, all of which is being paid for by my taxes. Now, on one hand, I'm paying for it. On the other hand, I'm not. They're being able to do this with what my taxes pay, and I made that comment. I actually pointed it out to my grandkids, and I'm on that level grateful for taxes. They support our police, support our military, support so much, and we're glad for that. But nonetheless, Romans 13, we are to pay taxes to whom taxes is due. We are to pray for our leaders. We're to honor the emperor, Scripture says. To the degree that we can be good citizens of an earthly kingdom and a heavenly kingdom, we're to do both. We are required to do both now. If we have to choose, now we're back to the apostles before the Sanhedrin saying, choose for yourselves whether we should serve God or men. But as for us, we cannot stop telling the things that we have heard and seen. Paul in Romans 13 commanded us to be subject to the authorities. He was beheaded because he wouldn't be subject to the authorities when they told him to stop preaching. Peter in 1 Peter told us to be loyal to and faithful to and honoring the emperor. He was crucified upside down, according to early tradition, because he wouldn't stop preaching. So at the end of the day, if I have to choose, I have to choose my highest authority. I'm thinking of my Cuban friends, my Cuban sisters and brothers that are having to choose heavenly authority over earthly authority in a way we're not here in this country, at least not yet. Pray we'll never have to be to that place, but that's how it boils down. Obey the magistrates, obey the local authorities, but ultimately obey Jesus as your highest king.
And we hope that that'll be a good, encouraging word for all of our audience today. Jim, thank you for the conversation. I hope it's been helpful to our listeners. And thank you for being a part of the Denison Forum podcast. And we look forward to you joining us for future conversations. If you have a question or a comment, you can find us at denisonforum.org. You can also send us an email at askjim@denisonforum.org. And if this has been useful, helpful to you, please share it with your friends. Thank you for joining us.